faculty for 27 years. And I am one of the co-editors of the Handbook for Critical Menstruation Studies, published earlier this year by Palgrave Macmillan. And I invited co-editors to talk with me today, Inga Winkler from Columbia and Milena Bacalji. Oh, shoot. I'm sorry.
Milena Bacalja-Perianis.
Bacalja-Perianis. I should have practiced it. I know we asked, I should have practiced. I knew two of the three. Milena Bacalja-Perianis.
Get it all the time.
I apologize. And I'm going to ask each of them to introduce themselves and highlight what's important about their scholarship and their work. And then we will talk about menstrual activism and some of the pieces in the handbook that deal with menstrual activism and period poverty and period equity and all kinds of related issues. Would you like to start, Inga?
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks so much for putting this whole series together. Thanks so much for doing all the work you've been doing on promoting the handbook. I think it's great to get the word out. And then thanks so much for inviting me and Milena today to speak about menstrual equity, menstrual activism, and basically where we are at with that today. So my name is Inga Winkler. I'm a lecturer in human rights at Columbia University in New York. And with Dr. Kisling, I'm one of the co-editors of the Handbook of Critical Menstruation Studies. I'm also the director of a working group at Columbia on mental health and gender justice, where I really enjoy bringing different people from different disciplines together to look at all things menstruation, basically. So our group covers a lot of different disciplines, from economics to gender studies to biomedical informatics. And that has led to some really rich discussions, and has also led us to teaching a course on menstruation, gender and rights that we'll offer again in the spring. I'm happy to leave it at that for now, and I'm also happy to later speak a bit more about my work and what I'm currently focused on in the context of menstruation. Thanks.
Milena?
So it's an absolute pleasure to be here today with all of you, and obviously particularly to be here with these two brilliant academics. I'm not an academic by trade. I'm a menstrual health expert and a gender specialist. So I'm one of the co-founders of the Menstrual Health Hub, and then also work for an organization called Integrity Global. And so my background is fundamentally in development programming and research and understanding social problems and how do we build advocacy, campaigns, programs, research, or products or solutions to sort of solve these problems. As you can tell by my accent, I'm Australian, but I'm based in the UK.
So I'm going to ask each of you this, but I'll go back to Inga first. How did you get started studying menstruation? How did you end up from human rights to menstruation, or was it the other way around? How did you end up specializing in menstruation research?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I often ask myself kind of how this trajectory happened. So because I do often get asked, so you're working on what, really? Menstruation and so much of it? And you think that's really a field of study? And yes, very much so. But for me, how it really started is before I came to Columbia, I used to work with the United Nations, and in particular with what's called a special rapporteur on the human rights to water and sanitation, which is a person who's appointed by the Human Rights Council, and is basically asked to look into promoting and protecting human rights around the world. And those mandates exist on all kinds of different topics, from torture to freedom of expression. And in our case, it was water and sanitation. And in that context, one issue that repeatedly came up is the question of how to deal with menstruation, and in particular in the context of visiting different countries. Many people came up repeatedly that they're struggling to deal with their menstrual periods, that they're struggling with washing, with having space, with having something to catch the flow. So that's really how it started for me over a decade ago now. And I think since then, I've increasingly broadened the scope, and you'll hear me talking a lot about that the focus on water and sanitation is much too narrow. I mean, it can certainly provide an entry point, and I think we've seen that to discussing challenges around menstruation. But what we are really talking about has nothing to do and certainly can't be fixed with access to water and sanitation. So what I'm much more interested now is really the socio-cultural dimension of menstruation. How do we perceive and see menstruation in people who menstruate? What role does menstrual stigma play? How is menstruation presented in the media? Is that shifting in any way? Looking at the increasing attention that menstruation gets, but then asking, well, what it is really that gets the attention. So this set of questions, and then a second set of questions that I'm dealing with is much more policy oriented, looking into what kinds of policies address menstrual needs, and then again asking, I mean, how do we make sense of these enormous developments that we've been seeing over the last decade, but also asking, well, what does actually get addressed and what doesn't, and generally seeing a rather narrow scope. And yeah, and I think all that really fed into the handbook. And I think what I enjoyed so much about co-editing the handbook with you and many others was, first of all, really our team, obviously, but also the way we approached it and really looking at a diversity of different contributions. I mean, from people across the world, but also looking at the different types of contributions from very different disciplines, and really appreciating all the different types of knowledge that we brought together. And I think over and over again, I mean, when I got feedback on the handbook, it was usually about some of these more unusual pieces that you don't usually find in scholarly volumes. And I think we all really benefit from broadening the conversation in that sense, and really making sure that we are listening to a variety of different people and seek to amplify their voices. Yeah, so I think that's kind of what I'm doing at the moment. So yeah, I want to hear more about how you came into this, Milena, because I actually don't know the story.
Yeah, I would like to hear that too, and hear how you founded the Menstrual Health Hub as well, and if that came first, or menstrual health activism came first, or.
It's funny. I wonder, did I become a crazy period lady, or was I born it? And there's just like a aha moment where it kind of comes out of you. But I started my career working in sexual and reproductive health rights. So working for NGOs, designing and implementing sexual and reproductive health rights programs in countries. And so about 7 years ago, I was working for a Dutch NGO called Samavi and managing programs in India, Malawi, and Tanzania, and particularly managing this large child marriage program in Malawi and India. And on one of the visits to the field where I was with the partners, and we were, talking to many community members, sort of like seeing like how are things going and trying to understand what kind of progress was happening, kept having conversations with girls, parents, teachers, like leaders, religious leaders, and everyone kept talking about periods, just kind of kept like sliding it in quietly, and they keep talking about the other issues around child marriage. And I remember after, I think the second or third day, sitting down with some of my colleagues and being like, why does everyone keep mentioning periods? Like, where is this link? What am I missing? And what I came to realize was that we designed this incredible, very expensive program around like trying to address and reduce child marriage. And what we weren't understanding was in the context of Malawi and what we see in, I think, several, countries in particularly East Africa, is that the moment girls begin menstruating, they become women, right? The moment of getting your period and having menarche means that you are a woman. And so they weren't marrying girls, they were marrying women. And there was this real kind of moment of, well, we're missing the boat here, right? Like we're trying to address issues like child marriage or sexual and reproductive health rights, or trying to reduce, teen pregnancy or abortion, all these other key issues. But actually this moment of you get menarche, and it's kind of what I described as the beginning of the end, right? We become gendered in everything that we are, and then we begin to the inequity, and that gap just becomes really, really huge. And so I became really fascinated in what if we started thinking of menstruation, the menstrual cycle, menstrual health as an entry point. And I think it's interesting that Inga started out kind of in the wash sector, because menstrual health is an intersectional issue that sits between so many different sustainable development goals. And it is both an entry point to address a variety of other issues, or you can use other issues to address sort of menstrual inequity. And so I started doing kind of either research within those programs. I went back and managed to convince someone to give me some money to sort of design a menstrual health training program and run a little pilot. I went into the field, and we were in the most rural place of Malawi you can possibly imagine. We had kind of 50 girls, women, and I actually had sort of menstrual cups and products. And so we ran this training, and I remember being asked, like, why are you interested in this? And I was like, because the stories that you tell is the exact same story that I had when I started menstruating, right? And there was kind of this shocked silence, being like, but you're white. That was the response. And I was like, it doesn't matter where you are. Like, there's this silence, there's this shame, there's this discomfort, and it doesn't stop, right? You can talk to girls, you can talk to women. This experience just sort of like continues in different ways. And obviously more people either have information, freedom, or access to products. But that whole experience of getting your period, that's something that is so natural that all of us talk about, is fundamentally disempowering everywhere you go. And that's linked to obviously shame around our bodies, but I do believe it's fundamentally linked to the fact that it's a sign that our kind of sexuality begins. And so there's so much fear related to it. And so it kind of started me on this journey around becoming a crazy period lady, of just the menstrual cycle is such an interesting entry point to understanding health across the whole life cycle. And so you can understand autonomy, you can understand health decision-making, sexual relationships, and then everything from like pregnancy to menopause and everything in between. And so several years later, I was really lucky to meet my two co-founders, Danielle Kaiser and Mariana De La Roche, and the menstrual health kind of like came into being. And so the Menstrual Health Hub is, we call it a social impact business, and our goal is to strengthen innovation, investment, and collective impact around menstrual health. So in the last 6 years, we've just seen this explosion of activity in this space, from development organizations to activists, researchers, new companies coming up. And it's so amazing, but it's incredibly under-resourced, underfunded. It's a very kind of fragmented space. And the idea behind the Menstrual Health Hub was, how do we create a movement, right? How do we bring everyone together to have more collaboration? And then when we're able to sort of build a business case around why this is important, we can sort of see that money funneling into the places it needs to go: better research, shifting policies, better businesses and products coming out there, and really kind of addressing the whole gambit. And so the Menstrual Health Hub is both this female health network where all those organizations can come together. It's around kind of knowledge sharing and ecosystem building and awareness raising. But several years in, we also realized is the private sector has a huge role to play. So most of us know that there's several huge conglomerates that have dominated the space and have spent a very long time making enormous amounts of monies off our body with shitty products. And it's just sort of these monopolies. And then in the last six years, we've seen startups, enterprises, just more women saying, I need something different. Like this product doesn't solve my problem, or I'm interested in something that's environmentally friendly, or, we don't have anything available in my community. And so we realized that there's big businesses, there's small, there's enterprises, community actors, and that we really need to be kind of improving the quality of the way that they're designing. And particular to the way that we approach it is just that there are needs everywhere. There are beneficiaries, there are customers, there are companies, there are social actors, and that we all need to be doing more to ensure access and to ensure women can make decisions over their bodies, and people who menstruate are able to manage their menstrual cycle and their health in better ways. And so being able to work with the whole gambit of actors is ensuring our ability to, that all people, right, can manage their cycle from day to day. And that's kind of really core to sort of who we are and what we want. And I think what's really interesting around both menstrual and I think female health more broadly is that there are biological needs which are just unmet, right? Which is from education to sort of products. We go to healthcare systems that have no idea what's happening in our bodies or minimize our pain. That a lot of this is a gendered experience. So we need to understand the female body, and I use the word female body because if you're born with a certain kind of biology that is known as being female, you'll experience, certain kinds of health needs of your lifetime, but that whole experience is gendered, right? There are all these social dynamics that play out. So the way that I engage with a healthcare provider, the reason I pick a particular product, company, why I make decisions is really based on these sort of gendered dynamics. And we need to start thinking about social science and social research and understanding humans, that human experience in the ways that we're designing products or designing solutions or designing even a kind of a company and how we speak to people. And I think this proliferation that we've seen in the last 5 years speaks volumes that there's sort of this kind of feminist revolution happening where we want more, we deserve more, and that there are a lot of organizations or companies or activists, I guess, and researchers who are really trying to sort of fill the evidence gap and really trying to put education or put solutions into the hands of those who need it most.
Yeah, boy, just so many questions just leap to mind. But one of the things I'm thinking is this is where your work, the work of the Menstrual Health Hub, intersects with Inga's work on menstruation and human rights, isn't it? The challenges of that you're describing. There are needs everywhere, and what Inga was saying about the sociocultural dimensions, the stigma, and the questions about the policies that institutions have regarding menstruation and how they're just way too narrow in scope to deal with what's really happening.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think there's an element of you fundamentally need an enabling environment around people to be able to sort of fulfill their basic needs. And we know in many countries that menstrual health, but women's rights in general are not part of these frameworks. And so we're seeing both institutional change, which is a lot of, I think, the work that Inga has worked on in terms of seeing those frameworks come into place. But then we're also seeing like you have to be able to implement them and enforce them. And then you can have an international mechanism, but is it working at a national level? And then you can have national mechanisms, but what does that mean for an individual living in a community? And so we talk a lot about as well things like company policies, right? Like, do you have menstrual leave policies? Like, what kinds of taxes do you have on products? I think all these things fundamentally end up impacting the ability of an individual to make decisions and to sort of navigate their life. And so we have sort of 4 pillars. We talk about research, innovation, education and learning, and policy. And all these 4 are fundamental to creating the right kind of environment for a woman, girl, or a person who menstruates to be able to just live healthy and to be able to kind of make those decisions on a day-to-day basis.
Do you want to jump in, Inga?
Sure. I know much of your work, and I think it's fascinating. I mean, the work that the Mental Health Hub is doing, and I think we agree on so much. And I think it's so important that you actually are in the space, because when we look at the space, more menstrual movement or menstrual activism, more broadly, I do I do agree that we've come a really, really long way. So let me start with that. I mean, let me start with the positive. I mean, when I think back, I mean, the kind of faces I got 10 years ago about, I mean, you're doing what? And I mean, just lots and lots of misunderstandings and lots of raised eyebrows and lots of questions whether I think that's really an issue. I think that has really changed, and we've come a really long way where we see the media often covering some topic around menstruation. We really see a burgeoning movement of NGOs and civil society organizations and social entrepreneurs and also larger international organizations getting into the space. And I mean, I certainly don't want to dismiss that. I think there is a lot happening, and a lot of that is great. But I also think there's a real challenge, or there are real challenges of taking a rather narrow framing, of taking a rather narrow entry point in many spaces that is not about menstrual health and everything you were just talking about, but that's very narrowly focused on so-called menstrual hygiene. And that's still very much linked to the water and sanitation and hygiene sector. And I mean, it's certainly not just my personal entry point of accidentally slipping into this through the wash sector. I think that's really, really common. And a lot of the policy development, a lot of the developments we see in the international space are very much linked to the wash sector. And I think that's a real challenge. Because I mean, on the positive side, I don't think we would be where we are in the context of human rights, in the context of development, without the wash sector. Because I think there's this general idea that I mean, they weren't afraid, they weren't intimidated to just take this on. I guess if you deal with shit and feces all the time, a little bit of blood and mucus really isn't that bad. And so it really did provide this entry point, but it also provided this entry point that is very focused on tangible outputs, and sometimes focused on quick fixes and really finding technical solutions. And I think with that focus and how that has turned into a focus on providing menstrual pads, in particular to girls in schools. I thought someone was asking a question about Scotland. I think Scotland is the exception in that it provides menstrual pads, or seeking to provide menstrual pads to everyone, or menstrual products. I think what we see so often is really providing pads to girls in schools has kind of become the striving narrative. And overall, what we see is that it's very much focused on menstrual hygiene, and this idea of keeping clean, of washing yourself, of keeping hygienic. And I think with that, the entire menstrual movement has become very, very sanitized, and puts a lot of emphasis on individual responsibility, and basically asks women and girls usually to manage their menstruation and to deal with it. And I think as a counterpoint, what we are not seeing and what we are missing is to actually tackle menstrual stigma, because I think that's at the root. I mean, it's not the question of keeping clean. It's really thinking about the impact that menstrual stigma has on all spheres of life. And we can't put a little patch on that or put a little band-aid on that. So I think the entire discussion, or the entire efforts around menstrual hygiene and providing menstrual products runs the risk of reinforcing the stigma rather than actually tackling it. And what I think we do need to think about are the much broader issues around the impact of menstrual stigma. So I mean, just think about, I mean, yourself. I mean, what kind of language are you using? I mean, do you really speak about menstruation, or do you use a range of different euphemisms that exist in every language? And I mean, are you comfortable talking to your healthcare providers about how you experience your period, or is there this hesitation, this shame, and then vice versa? I mean, when we look at healthcare providers, I mean, the experiences that we hear about that people have, I mean, all too often healthcare providers are not equipped to actually deal with menstrual health. And we certainly are not at the point where we take a comprehensive picture of menstrual health and really consider menstruation a vital sign and use that to increase body literacy and to really seek to understand what menstruation and the menstrual cycle tells us about our own bodies. So I think there's a long way to go, because I think that really influences a lot of how we perceive menstruation and how we perceive people who menstruate. And I think a lot of, I mean, what we face in the workplace or pretty much everywhere, I mean, this whole notion of people who menstruate as too emotional or hysterical or unfit for decision making. I think that's everywhere. And I mean, there's no way we can address this with this very sanitized movement we see at the moment. This is really a call for tackling this on a much broader level and really getting a set of different actors also involved in it.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. I'm so glad that I have the two of you here to talk about this on a global scale. You both have so much more international experience in this than I do. And I really appreciate what you said about WASH even taking it on, and the experience with feces and other things, making them maybe less touchy about it. But I always hate seeing menstruation compared to feces. And I've written about this years ago on the Society for Menstrual Cycle Research blog, because I used to get that when I was first writing about menstruation years ago. And people would say, well, I don't talk about my poop. I don't go, oh, well, you should see what I just did, in the bathroom. And I would say, it's not the same. It's not comparable. Like Milena was saying, menstruation is so highly gendered. Yeah. I would always, which is one of the reasons I resist that, that comparison. It's not comparable, and besides that, as a society, at least in the West here in the US, people do talk about poop all the time. Yeah. All the time. If you live in the US, tell me you haven't seen those dirty ass bears selling you toilet paper, right? Americans listening, you know what I'm talking about. Those Charmin, those ads for Charmin telling you enjoy the go, and those bears, those cartoon bears selling toilet paper, just practically twerking on TV to show you their dirty butts and how you need to use, can you imagine tampon ads showing people twerking? One company tried telling us to have a happy period, and consumers pretty much told them to bite it. Okay. But my larger point is, that stigma is still so powerful. And the movement, that we see in the West isn't about ending the stigma. It's about the products, or at best, let's not tax the products.
And I think that's so interesting, because I mean, when you look at the movement in the US or in the West more broadly, and when you look at the movement in many countries in the global South, I mean, the entry points are somewhat different. I mean, when we look at Senegal, for instance, a lot about building infrastructure and having sanitation facilities and having really private space for managing menstruation. And when we look in other countries, I mean, there's basically pads everywhere. And when we look in the US, I mean, it's also, I mean, it's slightly different, but it's still about taxation, and it's about product provision in certain settings. And I mean, what's the same everywhere? It's really this focus on the quick fixes, the very tangible outputs, something that can be quantified, something that you can report on, something that the media easily catches onto, because everyone sees kind of the immediate needs. And I think that characterizes so much of the space across countries. Yeah, so I wish we could find kind of the example to point to. I think they are there. I mean, there are little examples here and there, but overall, I think across the world we see this heavy emphasis on providing these quick fixes.
Yeah, and I hadn't even considered your point. You know, they can count. Well, how many pads our organization provided, and pads to this shelter, or if they're providing them to a country in the global south, that's countable, and we can say, look what we've accomplished. Whereas it's much harder to quantify reduction of stigma. You know, even though. Yeah, go ahead.
To jump, I was just sorry. I think like part of it is though that it's just it's because we're dirty. It's you have to. I think it's about quantifying it, but it's also because you're dirty and you need to make sure that you're clean. And so we put out this we focus on the products because it's just reinforcing constantly the narrative. And I think the irony when you both said like that. That people keep thinking that feces is the same as menstruation, and it's not for a multitude of reasons, but the number one is that menstrual blood is not a pollutant, right? Shit is literally the stuff that when you eat is left over that your body doesn't want to borrow and it can't do anything with, right? It literally is shit. Whereas like menstrual blood is just like the releasing of the lining. It isn't dangerous until it's like after a certain amount of time in itself. Like it's not something that actually is dirty. We just have such a strong narrative that menstrual blood is inherently like dirty and disgusting. And so that's why we get really kind of focused on this hygiene narrative. And I don't think we do ourselves much good either that we talk about periods of menstruation all the time and not menstrual cycles. And Inga, I think you mentioned that it's like we need to be talking about cycle literacy and body literacy because you only bleed between 4 and 10 days depending on your cycle. And we're seeing increasingly now menstrual suppression as, you know, really a major form of dealing with your period. So that's when you take some form of contraception in order to stop your period completely. And so what about the rest of the time, right? Your menstrual cycle is constantly on, it's releasing hormones, and it fundamentally impacts you every single day. When we understand our cycle, we can use kind of the hormones to be kind of more productive and do certain kinds of activities and less kinds of activities. But also it fundamentally is like this, we call it like the 5th vital sign, right? It's a compass for our health that if we understood it, we'd have such a better understanding of our wellness. And so for us with the menstrual health hub, we're really focused on this idea of literacy, right? Like the more we understand our bodies and what's going on, the more we're able to navigate our lives and navigate our health decision making. And we're really being failed there at an educational level. But I mean, from a research perspective, like medical clinical research doesn't actually fully understand the period. Like one of the things that makes me so mad is knowing that, so mostly male rats are used in studies. And when they do use female rats for testing different kinds of drugs, they often remove the ovaries because they think it messes with the results. It's a variable they can't control. And if you think about that, like, well, if I'm going to take a drug, my period is happening and my hormones are shifting. So we actually need to be like testing drugs with those hormones in play, right? And we see it as this thing that we don't want to talk about or think about because it's linked to things like Inga said, like we're too emotional and we need to be controlled and neutral, but there is something happening in our bodies and it's not about being like overly emotional or any of these kind of characteristics, but the reality is that our bodies produce certain kinds of hormones at different times of the month. It changes what is happening in our body. And so from the perspective of if I'm on a form of kind of cancer treatment, right, what does that mean if I still have my menstrual cycle or just my ability to be kind of productive and how I engage through life? And so I think the real failing is just it's periods. We spend all day long talking about just periods and periods, and you know, we stay away from the term period poverty at the Menstrual Health Hub because it's so problematic and everyone loves it because it's catchy and we can throw money at the poor little girls in schools. Can't solve period poverty because period poverty doesn't exist. People experience poverty and poverty exacerbates your ability to manage your period. And so when we talk about we're going to solve period poverty, you can't actually, you're setting yourself a task you can't solve, but it also gets really focused on just, again, the management, right? Get a product into someone's hand and you've solved all the problems, and you haven't. Like, people need to be able to make informed decisions, and having access to products is very important, but it's all these other pieces that I think you're both touching on so perfectly is what's needed around kind of stigma, access to information, like an enabling environment. It's understanding all of that so you can make the right kinds of decisions for yourself. And we're not getting there in that narrative. It feels like at all.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. That that we don't teach it. We don't teach it as part of a whole cycle. I teach women's health classes, and very few of my young students and young female-bodied students or male-bodied students have learned about periods as part of a cycle. I think I mentioned this in our session with Brianne. I like to play stump the students and say, who can tell me what body part menstruation begins in? And some of them will say uterus, or the ones that think they're being smart say ovaries, and nope, hypothalamus. The HPO axis, it starts the hypothalamus, the pituitary, and then the ovaries. It's part of a cycle. It's not just the flow. And to a student, I don't think I've ever had one that knew that. And I probably didn't learn that until I started writing about menstruation in grad school. And I was even older than they are, so I shouldn't be so smug about it, I guess. But yeah, and the providing the pads to girls in schools, that's just, as you say, one piece of the problem. Chris Boble just came out last year with that fantastic book about girls in the global South. The book's called The Managed Body for our listeners. And the bigger problem, girls are missing school because of pain as much as anything else. And that doesn't get touched on because of so much stigma. I see we've got a question that asking a little bit about menstrual health care. And one of the reasons, it's certainly not the only reason, but one of the reasons some of those diseases are under-researched and not treated is because of the stigma. The average time from the onset of pain and an endometriosis diagnosis is around 8 to 10 years.
Yep.
I think it's 8 years in the UK and
10 in the US.
10 in the US.
And fibroids, so 70% of white women are likely to experience fibroids by the age of 50, and that number I think goes up to 80 or 85 for women of color. 85% of women are going to experience a fibroid. Not all of them are going to be dangerous or in any way debilitating, but that's enormous. And so you look at fibroids, polycystic ovary syndrome, endometriosis, like we don't talk about menstrual-related illnesses because it's just periods, like you just have to push through, right? Like pain is just normal. And so none of us have any idea of like what is our normal level of pain. Like I like to talk about how you've got to figure out what your baseline is, and then that way you can understand like what is illness and what is wellness. If you understand your baseline, and it is different for many people. Some people can have no underlying health conditions but experience severe pain. The pain's not normal. I think the greatest disservice we've ever done is telling little girls that pain is normal. And so people don't get to like 30 or 35 until they're trying to have children, and then all of a sudden they can't have it, and they found out that they have severe endometriosis that has just kind of destroyed their whole system. And it was because I was just told that pain was fine.
Right.
And it's crazy.
Baby, suck it up. Yeah. Everybody has pain.
Yeah.
No, it's not supposed to hurt.
There's this really amazing, I've got to find it because I always mention this. There was this incredible sort of little campaign made in Holland, and they asked these men questions about period pain. How bad do you think it is? And they're like, yeah, like, I mean, I know it's not easy, but how bad can it really be? And then what they did was they used like little electrodes to shock them, but they started out with kind of low levels of pain, and they were like, this is what an average woman experiences. And then they went up to kind of slowly. They didn't even get to the extreme level, and the men were kind of in tears being like, no, you've got to stop. And then the few men that managed to get to those who are suffering from endometriosis or kind of heavy bleeding, I mean, they were like screaming, and it was just like, this is not possible that women experience this every month and continue to go to work and, do the shopping and take care of the kids. And you're like, actually, like this is this shows you how normalized this pain is. So it's not to suggest like we're stronger in any way, but it's just the discourse is normalized within us that it's an acceptable way to live.
I think there's this I'm so glad you bring this up, because I think there's this real risk with all the efforts we are seeing to normalize menstruation and to make it part of our conversation, which I think is great. And I mean, I certainly don't want to change that, but there is this risk that we get into celebrating menstruation, and I mean, which we should partly, but not to the extent that we think. I mean, when I see these slogans about well, everything you can do, I can do bleeding, or things like that. Well, maybe not. Maybe let's pause and let's acknowledge that it really depends on your circumstances, on your experience, on your body, and then I mean, there's certainly a lot more research, a lot more understanding that we need around menstrual pain, and really getting to address that better. And and the other thing I was so glad you brought up, Milena, is about period poverty, because it's it drives me crazy, because it's such a narrow entry point, and I think we completely miss the point. I mean, not only because I mean, poverty is a structural issue, and I mean, it's certainly, I mean, if you live in poverty, I mean, yes, obviously it affects your ability to manage your period, but it also affects everything else. And if we get into these perceived solutions of charitable drives to give out menstrual products, I mean, that's not going to fix anything, at least not in the long run. So I have real issues with that, and I think it also completely ignores all the different forms of discrimination and marginalization that we see. And I think that's the other issue where a human rights framework can be really helpful, to think about, well, who are we actually talking about, and whose needs are we ignoring? I mean, for instance, with all the discourse around women's health, I mean, what about trans and non-binary menstruators? And I mean, you already addressed some of the racial disparities and how certain health conditions play out differently. But also, I mean, just looking across the life course, I mean, there's so much focus on adolescence, but there's almost this perception as if menstruation stops once you leave school, and we don't really think about menstruation at the workplace. I mean, we certainly don't think about menopause. So I think there are so many disparities, whether we look at persons with disabilities, whether we look at people who live in poverty or in homelessness or in shelters, whether we look at trans menstruators, whether we look at how menstruation intersects with class and caste and ethnicity and race. So I think there's a lot more that needs to be addressed there, and we're not going to get very far with this default idea of basically a person who looks like me. So I think there's a lot more we need to explore there.
Can you explain, just give a short explanation of what you mean by looking at menstruation from a human rights framework before we open it up for questions?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an excellent question, and one that's really, really difficult to answer. I think generally, I mean, what I think a human rights framework is about in a nutshell is looking at, well, whose needs are we actually addressing? So really looking at discrimination, taking non-discrimination and equality as a starting point, and acknowledging that people have very different needs that we need to understand. I think that's one key aspect. A second key aspect is really about participation and agency, and taking people's decision making seriously, and giving people the opportunity to decide for themselves. I mean, that can mean, that you decide for yourself whether you want to curl up on the couch, or whether you want to take pain medication, or whether you are ready to just power through. I mean, that shouldn't be, those choices should be there, but also about many bigger issues related to healthcare and pretty much anything that affects menstruation. And then I think the third key aspect is really about accountability, that we need to put much more focus on the structural dimensions, and think about what that enabling environment looks like. So pretty much the contrary of charitable interventions to get menstrual products to people in need, as we call them. So I think those are three. I mean, there's obviously a lot more to it, but I think if we start with participation and agency and non-discrimination and equality and accountability, that gets us a long way.
So the easy things is what.
Oh yeah. I mean, absolutely. We can do that by next week.
Well, I was rereading your introduction to the section of the handbook about menstruation as fundamental, and and I think and you said you wrote about how menstruation was connected to just about every aspect of a menstruator's life, and of course I was thinking, and you gave all these examples, and then what really made it click for me as a human rights issue was when you wrote that it's all connected to power. And that's, what you just delineated in those three aspects. It's all connected to power, to having the agency, and just it's all about who has the power.
Yeah, and I think all too often, it's really about the power that others have over our bodies. And I mean, there are a couple of really excellent, I'm not just saying that because I picked them, but I think there are excellent pieces in the handbook where people really speak from their own experience about what they experience. And I mean, there's one by Stella Nyanzi, who is an activist in Uganda and was imprisoned due to her, not just her menstrual activism, but her much broader criticism of the Ugandan president. But there was linked to her menstrual activism. And I mean, there can't be a clearer way of demonstrating that power. But also when we look at, what's happening in prisons and jails around the withholding of menstrual products, or having to show that menstrual products have been used before any new products are issued. And I think what we see there is that there's no way to fix those issues, because it's not just about product accessibility. It's really about the power of the prison guard, and how the prison guard perceives people in prison and people in detention, and then acts on that. And by just making sure that products are available, we are not going to change any of those power dynamics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was looking through several articles in the handbook, trying to pick, well, what will best prepare me for discussion today. And one of the ones I read was the one about homeless menstruators, and it was very similar. Lots of shelters have plenty of products, but that doesn't mean that it's easy for the homeless menstruator or the menstruator living homeless to access them, because they still have to go and ask and and reiterate that power dynamic where, yes, I'm in this position where I don't have a place to live, and you control all these aspects to letting me stay here and allowing me access to meals. And now I have to let you know that I'm having my period and I don't have anything to bleed on. Please, sir, may I have a pad?
So sorry for interrupting. It is time to get to the Q&A when you're done with that thought, Liz.
You picked the right time, Lisa. Thank you for keeping us on schedule.
Sure.
We have a lot of things queuing up in the chat box.
So we have 3 questions and a comment. I'm going to start with one from an EWU student who asks, with Scotland's recent ruling making them the first country to make menstrual products free of charge, do you foresee other Western countries following suit?
This is a great question. I mean, I think there's a lot of movements that are hoping for this. I mean, I think one of the things you have to remember is Scotland has a very small population, right? And it has a relatively homogenous as well population, which kind of makes governing a little bit easier. So I think there may be other attempts at it, but will they have the same ability to see that change happen? I think that is going to be a lot tougher. It's an incredible moment for the movement, but it's also, I think there are a lot of questions, right? So when I saw this, and I think I had like 50 people send it to me, and everyone was like, look at this, it's amazing, have you seen it? And my first thought was actually, I'm a little bit nervous, right? So products are free, but like, who's paying for the products? What's the quality of the products? Like, what does this actually mean? And when you look at other commodities that have ended up being distributed for free, actually, they end up creating certain other kinds of challenges. So if you look at the HIV movement, with condoms being distributed for free, people no longer paid for them. When they stopped being distributed for free, you then had this kind of like lower uptake of condom use. And so I think there's a lot of kind of complexity here where we need to have access to these products, and Scotland has made such an incredible moment. We've also got to ask us, like, what is the quality, right? Where is it going to be? What is the access? Ultimately, someone is paying for it. How is that paid? Will this be sustainable? Are we going to see 5 years of this government and they're free everywhere and then it disappears? And then what does it mean from those people? And so I think we'll see other countries kind of taking up the movement, because it is so important to ensure that marginalized, vulnerable groups can access products free of charge. But I think there are a lot of other factors that play into it, and it comes down to, if it's been given out for free, well, the citizens are still paying for it, right? You're still just going to get taxed from somewhere to pay for those free products, and understanding what that looks like and kind of that complexity down the chain, I think will be really critical, in seeing how Scotland does it, and how well it does it, and then seeing what other countries can model or adapt it for their context. Inga?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything you said, and I think it would be a really interesting case to follow, to kind of to see how that plays out, and I mean, who's actually paying for it. And I mean, what we see, I mean, India doesn't provide products for everyone everywhere, but there are a lot of free products through local health centers, through schools. And I mean, in that context, what we've seen often is that the products are of low quality. So it kind of creates this dynamic where the people who rely on it have to make do with those products, and the rich can afford better products or have more choice, which I think plays a huge role as well. But I think the other question is really, I mean, going back to what I always talk about, I mean, that it's not just the products. And when I look at some of the reactions that we've seen in the US, where certain bills have been introduced about eliminating taxes on menstrual products, or about providing products in certain settings, I mean, in prisons and schools and shelters. I mean, the pushback that we have experienced, and some of the comments by male legislators about the risk of women hoarding products, or really, I mean, asking whether this is something they really have to deal with. I mean, all kinds of pushback. So I mean, on the one hand, I don't see it happening that quickly, but I think it also shows that we really need to address much more how we think about menstruation and the people who menstruate, rather than necessarily doing more on product provision. But yeah, I mean, I very much agree. I mean, I've gotten also the 50 emails and calls and notices.
And it's amazing.
So I mean, I do think it creates, yeah, I mean, it's certainly something that creates a lot more attention.
And it needs to be celebrated. And I noticed that Kate has commented that the quality is actually quite high in Scotland, and it's a Scottish company that's they're purchasing from the company. And so it's not, I guess, reinforcing product monopolies, which is a challenge. And I think it's great to see that there's been such a conscious thought put into it. But we do know from other contexts that there is a tendency for lower quality products than to be these sort of monopolies, and how that play out. And so we have this success that we're seeing, and it's just happened. So we've got to see how that kind of rolls out. But I think we'll see many other challenges happening in other contexts for it to be done to be done well, and we want to be cognizant of that as we sort of, we don't want that to be the core focus. I think there's a key thing that happens is this happens and everyone's like, this is what we have to do. We're going to spend all our energy and all our resources in pushing a government to make products free for everyone. And there are all these other factors I think that Inga's mentioned is really critical that have to be moving at the same time. And free products is not always the thing that's most needed. And we need to be thinking about things like actually the choice as well, right? And then the education and the policy and the enabling environment and all those sort of pieces, and figuring out what is most needed in the context, I think is really, really critical, rather than just pushing for taxation movements or free product movements or just education in one of these. It's really understanding in whatever context in which you're living, working, interested in, where is really that kind of key pressure point and where can we lean, rather than just trying to kind of piggyback on some of these movements, because I think they really have to be tailored for the context. And so for Scotland, this is the right solution for their context. I don't think it's necessarily the right solution for every context.
Thank you for that. The next question is from a student who's currently writing their master's thesis, and they're interested in menstrual health care and wonder your thoughts about the treatments for under-researched diseases like endometriosis, adenomyosis, fibroids, and the like. Do you think menstrual activism and digital activism in particular could achieve some advancements for these conditions? And that's the topic of their MA thesis, so congratulations on that too.
Amazing. I mean, that's really topical, and so glad you are doing that. I do think that we so slowly see a shift in how we address, well, I would say endometriosis in particular, and in certain countries only, I think. So I do. I mean, we just saw. I mean, in the US, we saw increased research funding for endometriosis being approved. I mean, we saw in New York that the menstrual health education bill has been adopted, which includes education on endometriosis in particular, and menstrual health more broadly. So I do think that there is slowly a shift. And I think a very, very slow shift. I think when we look at, I mean, how menstrual health conditions are being addressed in research, I mean, it's still pennies to the dollar compared to other health conditions. And when you think about that in the US, I think the estimate is, not that we really know, but the estimate is that 11% of women, I think between 15 and 44, suffer from endometriosis. I mean, it's huge. So, but I do think, I mean, very, very slowly, I mean, thanks to the tireless efforts of advocates working in that space, there is slowly increasing attention. But I also think that it's very, I mean, on the one hand, it's very disconnected. So just one example from my own research, we just completed a whole set of 80 interviews across 4 countries looking at policy development and policy advocacy around menstruation. And we had extreme difficulties to get people to speak to us from the mental health perspective, just to reach out, to find people to interview. So, I mean, a lot of what we did was interviewing people who work on what we've just been critiquing as too narrow. So I think the endometriosis advocacy is certainly there, but it's very delinked from other efforts in the sector. And I think we need to do much better in linking different advocacy efforts. And I think that's what you are doing so fabulously in the hub. But we still need more. And I also think that we need to reach out to other actors. I mean, whether it's medical professionals and their associations, whether it's different healthcare providers, whether it's organizations that do research in that area. So there are lots of other actors, and we also need to make sure that we don't fall into that trap again of having a very myopic entry point and focus, because I think what we do see is that endometriosis is getting more attention, which it certainly needs, but many other menstrual health conditions, whether it's fibroids or PCOS or others, don't get the same attention. And it's certainly not, I mean, it certainly is endometriosis, but also not just endometriosis.
Mm-hmm.
I think one factor that might, the person who asked mentioned digital activism, but I wonder how much of a role the visibility of celebrities with endometriosis has affected the visibility of endometriosis as a disease, and has helped support the advocates that you mentioned working on it. Lena Dunham has gotten a lot of publicity about how much work she's missed because of endometriosis. And then when she got a hysterectomy because of it at age 29, that made headlines all over the country. Padma Lakshmi, I think, has written publicly about endometriosis, and maybe somebody else. And not that it's a glamorous disease, but the kinds of things they talk about are being bedridden with pain and, kind of this stereotypical feminine mode of illness, whereas PCOS, polycystic ovarian syndrome, not so much. Those symptoms are, bad skin and excess hair growth. And that's not something that we're going to see a lot of celebrities come out with. Although Keke Palmer just yesterday or the day before posted on Instagram about just learning that she has PCOS, and that is why she has had so much trouble getting her skin to clear up. And she posted some selfies without makeup showing bad skin and saying, if this is your problem, you're not alone. I've just learned I have this, and I'm going to share about my journey. So that's kind of a big deal. But in the United States, at least, celebrity visibility, gives a lot of attention to illnesses and to breaking stigma. Like we've just in the last couple of months, we had Chrissy Teigen and Meghan Markle both talking about miscarriage, which is highly stigmatized in the U.S. So that got a lot of people talking and talking about their experience and getting more support.
And then I think also, I think celebrities play a huge role. And then also when I think about the people who I know who do research on endometriosis or who've introduced legislation on endometriosis, it's all people who experience endometriosis themselves, or many of them at least. So I think there's definitely this link. And I think the more people address it openly, as with anything else, I think that will certainly make a difference.
Mm-hmm.
So then we have, lastly, we have a comment and a question. And I'm going to start with the question and get to the comment if we have time, both from the same person. I keep anecdotally hearing about this interesting paradox from friends and colleagues who menstruate. On one hand, when they go to providers for symptoms or concerns about their menstrual cycles, they're often initially dismissed or minimized and not provided treatment options rather. On the other hand, if they see a provider for a general symptom or concern not necessarily related to the reproductive tract, and the provider cannot identify a diagnosis, explain the problem, or treat it, the provider often finds a way to link it to the menstrual cycle or hormones, air quotes, hormones, as another way to dismiss it. How can we better equip people who menstruate and providers with knowledge about both menstrual disorders, underlying conditions, and the standard menstrual cycle to avoid these two related problems?
This is, this is a serious problem everywhere in the world. I don't think I necessarily have kind of a simple answer, but to give you an idea, is like the average GP, like general practitioner or doctor, spends very little time in the degree studying the menstrual cycle. I think there was one study that said it was around 8 hours or 10 hours in the UK for the average doctor. This is before their specialty. This is like general medicine. And so, I think generally speaking, it's that you have a medical system itself that is gendered, right? That the understanding that you wouldn't need to know that any kind of patient that you're working with who can menstruate, there are questions that you would need to ask and understand to see, like, even if it is a non-menstrual related illness, is like, how is that going to intersect or impact with the menstrual cycle is a failing, I think, of our healthcare systems everywhere. And so, I mean, one is sort of improving the research that's happening and that evidence, and encouraging more of the students who are on this call, and I think more broadly, to be doing more of that research. But we also need to be, I guess, improving in that educational facility for those we go to for knowledge to have it, because doctors don't know, right? Like, you turning up to a doctor and saying, I have severe pain, and without a doubt, it is, are you on the pill? If you're not on the pill, we'll put you on the pill. We'll normalize your cycle, we'll put you on the pill. And it's like, it's not a normalizing my cycle. Like, that's not a helpful solution. It doesn't really kind of get into that depth. And so I think increasingly you have the patient having to educate the doctor. So I've been online and I'm looking at these things, and like having to be more kind of, I guess, forceful in what they're asking of the medical providers, which is problematic. But I do think this idea of like, how do we become more self-aware to be able to come to these conversations and ask for more, right? So it's not saying like, I read 17 articles and I definitely have cancer, but it's just being like, I've been online and I've read that, you know, these 3 issues are sometimes linked to some of my symptoms. Can we please test? Can you please explore this further? And actually asking what you need, and teaching people how to navigate healthcare and navigate those conversations with their healthcare providers. I think that's really, really critical, because as Liz said, the 10 years to be diagnosed with endometriosis in the US and 8 years in the UK, that's insane. And if you ask the people who have been diagnosed, they'll tell you they went over and over and over again, and they were constantly dismissed. And so I think one thing that is like within our power to shift is actually that being able to people make more informed decisions, right? Is like, where is the power that I do have, and then how can I use that, and how can I enable people to navigate healthcare decisions and navigate and push for what they need. I don't think we should all go online and decide what we have or we don't have. I'm definitely not encouraging that. But I think being able to sort of understand that there are different options, to understand that pain isn't normal, that there are certain kinds of conditions that exist, and then hopefully being able to explore that better. Because yeah, what you've mentioned is, it happens all the time, being dismissed, being minimized, being wrongly diagnosed. You know, there are many cases where you hear they were told to have a hysterectomy at 24 because they had pain. Like, that's not your go-to solution for menstrual pain. Your 2 options shouldn't be going on the pill or having a hysterectomy. There has to be something in between. It's kind of crazy where we're at.
Yeah, I don't have that much to add, other than to say, so good to see you, Amelia, or not see you, but knowing that you are here. Thanks so much for joining. And I mean, I very much agree with everything you said, Milena. And I think, I mean, a lot of it has to do with, I mean, on the one hand, learning more about the health conditions as such, and being informed and having a sense of what it might be, and being able to take that to your healthcare provider, but also really having a good sense of what's happening to your body. And I mean, one of my colleagues, Noemi El Haddad, in our working group, I mean, she works from a biomedical informatics perspective of really improving the patient healthcare provider relationship. And I think a lot of that has to do with actually, well, tracking your symptoms, tracking your data, determining what patterns are there. And I mean, once you have that information and really have that tracked over quite a while, I think that helps a lot in really being able to engage in a much more informed conversation with healthcare providers. And really using that information and that body literacy that you yourself developed to improve that relationship. But there's a long way to go. And I mean, I've very much heard, I mean, the same kind of 2 related but seemingly contradictory experiences. I mean, I've heard so much about these. I mean, on the one hand, the kind of dismissing the pain, dismissing all of that, but then also being diagnosed very quickly with PMDD without really having yeah, having all the symptoms or not really taking, looking very much into underlying conditions. So I think there's a long way to go. But you know that.
Yeah.
And we have about 2 minutes for closing thoughts. Thank you all.
Yeah, I just think I can't really disagree with what either of you have said, but I just keep thinking that's not fixing the underlying problem, that doctors aren't getting a good enough medical education. You know, that's a little better than my students, but than what my students are getting, but 10 hours in all of medical school?
In some of them, yeah, it's kind of crazy.
Yeah, when we know that more than half of their patients are likely to be people who menstruate. We know that that's who goes to the doctor most often, and who, for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is because of reproductive health concerns and having babies. And yet that's the part of the human body they have the least knowledge about. Yikes. It goes back to the larger questions about larger issues about, changing stigma, breaking the stigma, which we have to, I always say you break stigma by breaking it. So we got to just keep talking about it, keep doing the advocacy and education. And it's not just a period, it's a whole cycle. So we just have a few minutes left. So I do want to thank you both so much for your contributions, for being here. And we didn't really get a chance to say very much about the handbook, but I want everyone to know how much Milena contributed to, her fingerprints are all over that. Yes, thank you for holding it up. I have a copy nearby too.
It is,
yes.
And it's free access online. If you haven't done it, check it out. Like it's extraordinary, between the academic work, people from the field, organizations. It's obviously we're biased because we all were involved in it. We don't make money if we sell it, so but it really is incredible in terms of those diverse experiences and voices and perspectives, and just really understanding like how critical this is, I think, to the experience of so many people in the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're super proud of it. You can tell, and and as Milena said, we're not making a dime. So don't. Yeah, if you feel like you want to support us and buy the hardcover, it doesn't benefit us. It just makes the corporation richer. So, but if you want it, that's your choice. But yeah, you can read it online. You can download it as an EPUB for your Kindle or your Nook or whatever, or you can read it on your iPad or your computer or whatever. However you want to read it, we don't care. Just read it. But yeah,
thanks so much, Liz, for bringing us together. I mean, I really enjoyed the conversation, and I know that I've been saying a lot of about this is missing and that's missing, and we're not doing this, and there are huge gaps and risks. But I do want to end on a positive note, because I think what really gives me hope is all the young people who are coming into this space and who are really interested in taking this forward, and to really take a broader perspective of just looking at getting people to keep clean and looking at removing taxes and having a very narrow perspective, but really thinking about, I mean, what can we do to tackle stigma, looking at all different areas of menstruation and how it impacts our lives. And I mean, I'm super excited about the handbook, and I'm also, when I engage with students, our working group and the course we're teaching, we have huge interest in that. So I think that's a really positive sign, and all of you being here are really positive signs. So so go out there and do what you can to tackle menstrual stigma and break it.
Yeah, and for those of you, if this is the first of our sessions, there's 3 others that you can catch on YouTube. And this one will eventually be on YouTube if you want to share it. They'll be up for, I hope for a long time. I should grab some copies so I can continue to share them on my personal website. And I want to thank Lisa Logan for all of their work in making all these sessions run so smoothly, and the work study students who have helped with that and helped get it on YouTube so that people have also been able to watch it there and that the videos go up. And our sponsors, the Gender, Women's, and Sexuality Studies program at Eastern Washington University, and our College of Social Sciences, who not only sponsored this, but also actually suggested it. So that's some good deaning over there. So thank you to them, and thank you to all of you for coming and participating. Thanks, everybody. Stay well, stay safe.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.